Have you ever felt the world narrow to a single trail? The crunch of frost the wind, like a thin blade the sky, so close as like a ceiling you could tap with your knuckles, and yet somehow the feeling that the path is widening, opening into something vaster than geography. The old Himalayan traders spoke about that sensation in half smiles and side glances. They said you don't find certain places. Those places choose you. And one of those places, they whispered, is a kingdom not drawn on maps, not truly a city of light hidden in the folds of the tallest mountains on earth. They called it Shambhala. The stories never begin in the same way, but they always end the same, with a door, not a wooden door or a brass gate, but a moment that behaves like a door. A glacier fog lifting all at once. A storm that stops exactly in the middle of the valley as if someone pressed pause. The sudden scent of blooming flowers at 5,000 meters where nothing should bloom. You're walking and then you're not walking. You're crossing. And when you cross, the mountains rearrange themselves like a curtain parting, and there it is, a city so bright the snow looks dull beside it. For monks, Shambhala is a vow. They speak of it in careful tones, as if language itself might bruise it. For travelers, it is a rumor that keeps them moving, a flame that never quite goes out. For governments, it has been a problem. Because if Shambhala is only a myth, why do archives carry such peculiar footprints? Funding lines for expeditions with goals that sound like poetry, cables that reference rumors, as if they were coordinates reports stamped, restamped, and then redacted to darkness. We start in a text old enough that the ink of its copyists is itself a kind of history, the Kalachakra Tantra. You hear the title and think of something airy and devotional, but the Kalachakra is not content to speak only of meditation and compassion. It speaks about cycles of time, of kingdoms of the human mind when it is a city under siege. It mentions a realm called Shambhala, ruled by a line of kings whose names are less important than the job they've agreed to do. Watch, wait, and when the world tilts far enough toward ruin, step in. 32 kings, some say. Others say the number is not arithmetic but symbolic, guardians of a circle that must not break. Their capital is sometimes called Kalapala, name that feels like a bell struck once and left to sing in the air. There the texts say the Dharma, call it wisdom, call it rightness, doesn't live in books. It lives in streets, in houses, in the way light falls on a doorway at noon. Every age writes its apocalypse in the language of its tools, and if you read closely you find something unnerving, depictions of a final conflict that do not sound like bronze swords and horsehair banners. They sound like us, like factories and engines, like metal that flies. The cruel kings of a declining world, the texts suggest, will place their faith in terrible machines, and the last king of Shambhala, Rudra Chakrin, the wrathful wheel turner, will ride against them. Is that poetry or prediction? Maybe both. But tell me this, what does it do to a general, a minister, an ideologue, armed with budgets and pride, to hear that somewhere beyond all their charts is a city that has already accounted for them in a prophecy 1,000 years old? This is where the story frays and multiplies. Ask a scholar in Lhasa where Shambhala is, and they might tilt their hand north. Ask a pilgrim in Dolpo, and they'll trace a crescent east to west, a smile of mountains. Ask a hermitage mystic, and they will close their eyes and say very softly, turn inward. Yet the testimony that persists across time is not a set of coordinates, but a condition. Shambhala is not hidden because it is far. It is hidden because you are not yet the kind of person who can see it. When you are, the valley opens. If you are not, it remains stone. The Himalayas are not only rock and ice. Ask anyone who has slept inside a yoker tent while wind speaks through, seems like a ghost. They are a library of places inside places. Tibetans call them biol, hidden valleys sealed by saints and opened in eras of decline to shelter who must be sheltered. In some versions of the story, Shambhala is the crown of all biul, a biul of biuls. Imagine that, an ecology of refuge, of thresholds, inside thresholds, with the last and brightest kept for when the light thins to a thread. But something happened when the story crossed the passes and entered rooms lit by gas lamps and later by electricity. It found people who believe that secrecy is a posture, not a principle. People who poke at everything hidden with the long stick of curiosity sharpened to ambition. Theosophists in their salons named it the headquarters of Earth's spiritual government, where masters with chalk-white beards convene to steer the species by telepathic memo. Mystics painted it as a high plateau city whose domes catch the sun like coins. Journalists made it an exotic paragraph, the thing to mention after tea traders and snow leopards. And then men in uniforms began to write its name. Consider how a map looks to someone who uses it like a weapon. Blank spaces are accusations. They say you don't know. And the men who can move armies do not like to hear that sentence. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the northern deserts and the Himalayan arc were the chessboard of empires. Russian, British, later German, and Japanese intelligence treating rumor as bait. It's easy to imagine a conversation in a paneled room. If there is a kingdom in those mountains, and if that kingdom is old enough to have kept records, and if those records mention energies, metals, processes, why not see? Why not send quietly, ask loudly, pay handsomely? Why not? Not all seekers chased power, some chased meaning. A painter stood in the wind near the Altai and said, I saw a sign in the sky, and his wife wrote about a city that promised not escape but responsibility. Shambhala not as an escape hatch from the world, but as a contract to return to it better armed with compassion. Pilgrims walked with prayer wheels, not compasses, and the mountains answered sometimes with flocks of birds, moving like cloth sometimes with nothing at all, because nothing at all was the answer they needed. But the other kind of seekers left thicker shadows, expeditions with scientific covers that felt a size too small like borrowed coats, men who measured skulls and also asked old shamans very precise questions. Atheist bureaucrats back in their capitals authorizing funding for cultural study in regions they otherwise mocked as superstitious, because even rationalists make room for a footnote that could be a lever. And later across an ocean, a set of offices where unusual research was a line item, where the mind itself was a theater of operations. Did those offices ever type the word Shambhala? Maybe not. Maybe they typed Tibetan techniques, altered states, non-local perception, and the mountains heard and smiled. If you are thinking this is where the story tips into fantasy, take a breath with me and try a different angle. Suppose Shambhala is not a single dot but a pattern. Suppose it appears whenever and wherever a civilization is just self-aware enough to feel its own decline and just proud enough to think it can dodge the consequences without changing its heart. In such hours, myths behave like mirrors. They show us what we could still be if we remembered. And they show opportunists something else, a place they might break into and steal from. What does power do in the face of a parable? It treats it like a safe. There are field notes you can read in quiet libraries, the ink turned brown at the edges. They describe conversations with headmen who would not draw a map but drew a symbol, a circle inside a lotus, and said here. They describe hearing a bell at noon that could not have rung because there was no bell in that village. They describe light behaving badly, bend around corners, hold in the air. Scientists shrug altitude. Pilgrims nod threshold. The more modern we become, the more primitive our questions grow. What is a city? What is a weapon? What counts as technology? If a line of kings kept a covenant to preserve a pattern of compassion, so exact it makes suffering lose traction, is that religion or physics? If a room can train the mind to quiet to a blade's edge until the blade becomes a bridge, is that mysticism or engineering? We use the word machine like monks use the word mantra, with reverence and fear. The Kalachakra speaks of a wheel that turns and turns until it turns itself out, and we thought it meant time. Perhaps it means us. Walk with me a little deeper into the snow. Look at the old passes where the wind pours like water. Imagine a caravan 3 centuries ago, the bells on the lead, yak, duel with rhyme. They stop at a rock field that looks like every other rock field and set down their loads and do nothing at all for a very long time, and then one of them stands and takes 3 slow steps forward, and everything is different. The same men with satellites would stand there today and see rocks. The same men with drones would see rocks from above with exquisite accuracy. The threshold would not open because thresholds do not open to force, they open to fitness. The key is not metal, it is a condition. You will hear the counter-argument that Shambhala is inward allegorical, a teaching device. Okay? but a teaching device for what? For restoring a world beyond parable, for steering a culture back from its furies. If a story can do that, how much more real do you need it to be? And if a story can do that, is it so strange that governments might court it or fear it, that ideologues might want to possess its scaffolding without swallowing its medicine? There is a rumor in the mountains that some of the gates are mobile. They do not stay in the same place from century to century the way a path across a glacier changes, because ice is not as static as it looks. This would explain why maps fail even when drawn by careful hands, why a guide who found a sanctuary last winter comes back to find only a cliff. It would also explain another persistence, the sense among villagers who live under cutlass stars that some visitors are not looking for a village at all. They are looking for a resonance. A door's keyhole is an absence shaped like a promise. The mountains are a choir of such shapes. You tune to the right one and the brass turns. Let me show you a conversation I've heard in more than one dialect from Baltistan to Mustang. A stranger asks an old man, "Where is Shambhala?" The old man laughs. Not kindly, not unkindly, just like someone who has stepped in the same puddle many times. He says, "Keep walking." When your walking becomes prayer, when your speech becomes wind, when your breath stops trying to bargain with the sky, then you'll be near. Near where? The stranger insists. The old man shrugs. Near where you started. It sounds like a riddle because it is. But riddles are not evasions. They are protections. They keep doors from being kicked in by the wrong intention. If you are still with me, and I hope you are, draw a deeper breath. This is the place in the path where a certain kind of listener leans closer. Others peel off. They wanted a photograph, not a vow. If you are the leaning kind, listen to this. Some claim the kings of Shambhala are not kings as we understand them. They do not sit on thrones. They sit at the far end of disciplines whose names we have not yet invented. One is the Lord of Attention, whose mind can hold a city's suffering without turning away. One is the Queen of Speech, whose words change the conductivity of violence, the way a salt crystal changes water. One is the Minister of Thresholds, who keeps track of all the doors and all the times they have opened and why. When the texts say king, perhaps they mean master of a function that keeps the world from tearing. And yet the prophecy wears armor. It says there comes a time when counsel fails, when example fails, when the ambient cruelty of a weary era organizes itself into rulers whose only virtue is appetite. Then the last king. Wrathful will turn not because he loves anger, but because he remembers the design of gravity. Mounts a white steed. We see the horse and think fairy tale. The horse may be an image for a kind of movement, rapid, sure-footed, beyond obstruction. The army he leads is described in some tellings as innumerable, and we try to picture battalions marching. But what if we're looking the wrong way? What if the army of Shambhala is a change in the world's weather? A front of clarity moving across continents, snapping the spine of certain illusions. A return of shame to the shameless. A winter for corruption. We make our futures out of metaphors. Then the metaphors become machinery. If a 12th century poet says ironbirds and 21st century readers think jets, we think we've caught the poet predicting technology. Maybe we've missed the deeper point, that a species eventually learns to fly on all the wrong wings, and when it does, it must choose whether to leave the sky better. Then it found it. The last king's war is not against metal, it is against forgetting. Still tracks appear in the snow. There were men with notebooks, hierarchies, with rubber stamps, dossiers that thickened around any rumor that refused to die. There were hand-drawn maps kept in pockets with circles, where mountains make a cup with arrows pointing to caves that breathe. Some of those maps returned to capitals and were filed. Some never returned at all. A few live in museums under glass. Tourists lean over them and see lines. The mountains lean over them and see jokes. You want something practical, a clue that smells like leather and smoke. Try this. Every credible account speaks of a sound. Not the wind scream, that is ordinary. A tone like a metal bowl sung long after the striker has been set down. The travelers who reported it used different words. Humming, ringing a wire in the air. But their faces, if you could see them, wore the same astonishment. The sound did not come from a direction. It came from the fact that there was a way through, and the way itself had a voice. Is Shambhala a place built by hands? Some say yes, and they describe terraces and water that runs clear and fields that grow barley so golden it looks painted, and a hall where the ceiling is a night sky, but not ours, an older one, a memory sky. Some say no, and they describe arriving not in architecture, but in a condition. The condition tastes like milk after fasting, like the first sleep after a vigil. Either way, those who speak sincerely about it never boast. They grow very quiet. They choose their words the way a monk chooses which grain of rice to keep for seed. We live in a time that teaches us to escalate, louder, faster, more. But mountains teach the opposite lesson: remove what isn't necessary, and the necessary becomes bright. The men who came with instruments for measuring brightness, weight, mineral content, they collected. They did not remove. And so the door did not behave. How do you enter a city whose gates are allergic to greed? You don't. You can walk past its outer wall 100 times and never know it, and somewhere on the other side a child will laugh, and not even the laugh will cross over. Let me leave you with a scene like a coin you can keep in your pocket. A winter noon, a sky the color of old silk. 3 monks and a woman in a boiled wool coat stand on a ridge. The woman is foreign, her notebook is full. One monk is young with ears pink from the cold. The eldest stares without squinting. The middle monk's mouth moves around a mantra so softly the sound never escapes. The woman asks carefully because she is not a fool, is Shambhala real? The eldest turns. He looks at her as if she has asked whether breath is real. Yes, he says. But then he lifts one finger, the gesture people make when they are about to say the part everyone forgets. But not like you think. The wind tugs at their sleeves. The young monk smiles because he remembers the gate, as a boy a brightness that filled his chest. The woman writes the words not like you think, and later a reader will circle the phrase in red pencil as if it were a mistake. It is not a mistake. It is the whole instruction. From here the story weaves into stranger cloth, a trail of letters in archives with stamps from empires that no longer exist, a handful of photographs that do not show what they were supposed to show, a clutch of names, painters, spies, philologists, colonels, who all learn to pronounce the same syllables with different motives. But that is for the next stretch of the path. For now, hold this much in your hands. There is a city that is also a vow, a geography, that is also a mirror, a prophecy, that may be less about a date on a calendar than about a habit in the human heart. When that habit calcifies into cruelty, something old stirs. Call it a king if you like. Call it a change in weather. The mountains have a word for it. They say it very softly because names are doors. And if you are listening at night under a blanket, the blue light gone dim, and the room a little colder, listen harder. Hear the tone that doesn't come from a direction. Feel the way your breath changes when a threshold is near. You don't have to be in the Himalayas to be at the beginning of a pass. You just have to be ready to walk without insisting the valley show itself on your schedule. In a world obsessed with forcing gates, Shambhala is the one that opens because you stopped pushing. When we return, we will put our hands into the paper trail, into the years when industrial empires tripped over sacred rumor, when artists and agents followed the same caravan roads, for occult seasons when the quiet word Shambhala could get you a monastery's hospitality or a ministry's attention. We will read what can still be read, we will infer what has been blacked out, and we will ask a forbidden question. What if the prophecy did not wait for the future? What if a part of it already happened and we were too busy counting machines to notice the weather change? Stay with me. The next bend is not far. The Kalachakra Tantra warns that when the world tilts too far into shadow, the armies of Shambhala will rise. Not armies of cruelty or conquest, but armies of restoration. Forces that carry with them a memory so sharp that corruption recoils. This prophecy has always lived uneasily in human ears. Some take comfort no matter how dark a dawn waits. Others take it as a challenge. If such a power exists, why wait for destiny? Why not seize it now? The Tibetans speak of the last king Rudra Chakrin in language that vibrates between poetry and dread. His name means wrathful wheel turner, and his image is both awe and warning. He is not gentle. He does not come to soothe. He comes because counsel has failed, because Greed has organized itself into an empire because violence has made itself a law. He rides at the head of an army described as countless. But the detail that chills is this: they will fight with machines, weapons of fire, and light devices that belong to no medieval world. The texts say iron birds and chariots of fire that move without horses. They say weapons that can burn cities in an instant. We read them today and feel the shadow of our own age. Jets and rockets, nuclear fire, destruction on scales our ancestors could never have imagined. But here is the puzzle: how did 1,000-year-old text echo what would only become real in the 20th century? Coincidence? Vision? Or is it possible that Shambhala is not only a prophecy of the future, but a memory of the past? An echo of civilizations before ours whose knowledge broke the world and had to be hidden? This question became an obsession, and obsessions always attract dangerous seekers. In the early 20th century, as Europe teetered between wars, the whispers of Shambhala crossed borders not as scripture, but as rumor of power. Russian mystics, German occultists, British colonial officers, they all carried fragments of the legend in notebooks and coded reports. Shambhala became more than a paradise, it became a prize. If you could find it, you might hold the key to ancient technology, hidden wisdom, or even weapons older than history. Let us walk into the snow shadows of those years. The Soviets were among the first to take it seriously. It seems strange, an atheist regime funding expeditions to search for a mythical kingdom. And yet in the 1920s and 30s, under the banner of ethnographic research, Russian teams crossed into Mongolia and Tibet. Some of them were scientists. Some were spies. Some were neither, but carried maps and questions that revealed their true motive. In Moscow, whispers moved through the corridors. The East held secrets, and secrets could be weapons. One of those men was Nicholas Roerich, a painter, philosopher, and mystic who traveled through Central Asia between 1924 and 1928. His journals describe visions of radiant cities, of valleys opening like doors of skies that carried signs. Discs of light that hovered and vanished, what today we would call an unidentified flying object. To the Soviets, Roerich's journeys were worth watching. To Washington later, they were worth intercepting. To the villagers who saw him pass, he was simply another foreigner chasing a rumor the mountains had guarded for centuries. And then came the Nazis. In 1938, an SS unit under Heinrich Himmler launched the German Tibet expedition. On the surface, it was a scientific mission: zoology, anthropology, geography. Beneath the surface, it was something else. Himmler, obsessed with Aryan mythology, believed Tibet might be the cradle of a primordial race, a bloodline linked to ancient gods. And in his libraries, the name Shambhala was underlined again and again. If Shambhala held ancient wisdom, Himmler wanted it. If it held technologies of war, he would not hesitate to seize them. The expedition trekked into the Himalayas, measuring skulls, interviewing monks, mapping terrain. What exactly they found has never been fully revealed. Some documents survived the war. Some were destroyed. Some perhaps are still hidden in archives. But the whispers say the SS believed they were following the trail not just to a mythic city, but to a doorway into a past that could be weaponized. Think about it. A regime obsessed with destiny, seeking a prophecy that spoke of a final war, convinced that somewhere in the mountains was a kingdom armed with knowledge older than Rome. Can you imagine the weight of that? To men like Himmler, Shambhala was not allegory. It was a target. And then, as the world tore itself apart in fire and steel, the legend went underground. The monks kept silent. The mountains closed. But the obsession did not end. It simply changed hands. When the Cold War began, the CIA turned its gaze toward Tibet. Officially, their concern was strategic. The Himalayas as a buffer between China and India, Tibet as a pressure point in the struggle against communism. But in the vaults of Langley, the files tell another story. Remote viewing, psychic warfare, altered states of consciousness. And among the coded language, you find the same old whispers. Hidden kingdoms, ancient knowledge, techniques for seeing beyond the visible. If Shambhala was not a place you could bomb or occupy, perhaps it was a discipline you could replicate in a laboratory. The monks, when asked, simply smiled. They have always smiled at such questions. To them, Shambhala is not a toy for regimes. It is a covenant. You cannot take it by force. You cannot bribe your way in. You can only arrive when you have become someone who can see it. But that has never stopped men from trying. Imagine the scenes: a Soviet officer frostbiting his beard, listening to a herder who says he once heard bells in the mountains where no bells could be. A German anthropologist, notebook trembling in his hands as a monk, tells him, yes, Shambhala is real, but not for you. A CIA agent recording testimony of a refugee who swears he walked into a valley that glowed like dawn and then walked back into darkness. These are not the fantasies of tourists. These are the obsessions of governments who believe myths can be mined like ore. And beneath all of it, the prophecy waits. Rudra Chakrin, the wrathful wheel turner, a king who will ride when cruelty has crowned itself as law. What if the Soviets feared that king? What if the Nazis hoped to become him? What if the CIA wondered whether he had already risen in ways they could not understand? The Himalayas have seen armies march, empires collapse, borders redrawn, but they have also kept their secrets. And the greatest of those secrets is whether Shambhala is a myth, a memory, or a city waiting just beyond the next ridge. Stay with me, because what comes next is darker still. Theosophists spoke of Shambhala as the throne of hidden masters. The Nazis sought it as proof of an ancient bloodline. The Soviets hunted it as forbidden knowledge. The CIA studied it as a weapon of the mind. But all of them, in their own way, may have been chasing the same echo, the sound of a door that only opens when you stop trying to force it. And yet, the record suggests some of them came very, very close. The Kalachakra prophecies speak in a voice that feels less like a prediction and more like an inevitability. They tell of a time when the world will grow heavy with its own corruption, when rulers will rise who wear cruelty like a crown and call greed their god. In that time when the sky seems to lean toward fire and every city trembles under the weight of its own violence, the gates of Shambhala will open. The last king, Rudra Chakrin, the wrathful wheel turner, will ride at the head of an army so vast that the earth itself will shake, and the forces of darkness will scatter like ash in a wind too strong to resist. The Tibetan monks never meant for this prophecy to be a bedtime story. It is not comforting. It is not gentle. It is not about salvation by patience. It is about intervention, sudden, fierce, and final. Rudra Chakrin does not negotiate. He does not soothe. He cuts like a blade drawn after centuries of silence. The texts say he will appear when the world has exhausted every other path. When dialogue fails, when compassion is dismissed as weakness, when the rulers of the earth become tyrants whose appetites have no end, then and only then the army of Shambhala will rise. What unsettles even modern readers is the way the prophecies describe this war. They do not speak of spears or bows. They speak of iron birds that darken the sky. They speak of chariots of fire that move without horses, weapons that can burn whole cities in an instant. They speak of a conflict fought not in villages with torches, but on a scale that sounds disturbingly like our own century. Nuclear fire, machines of steel and light, engines of war that our ancestors could not have conceived, and yet which the Kalachakra describes with eerie precision. So how did these ancient scriptures foresee such things? Was it simply metaphor, a poetic way of warning about human arrogance? Or was it something darker? An echo of knowledge preserved from a forgotten age, a memory of civilizations before ours that destroyed themselves with their own machines. If Shambhala is real, perhaps its kings do not only guard wisdom. Perhaps they guard a record of disasters humanity has lived through before, disasters we are on the verge of repeating. It was these questions that began to spread beyond monasteries, beyond mountain passes, and into the salons of Europe and the corridors of power. By the late 19th century, the legend of Shambhala had slipped from sacred texts into the hands of mystics, philosophers, and eventually men in uniform. To Western mystics, Shambhala was the seat of a hidden brotherhood of masters, beings who guided human civilization from behind the veil. To imperial officers, it was a rumor of power in lands they could not fully conquer. And to ideologues, it was a temptation. If such a kingdom existed, perhaps its secrets could be seized. In the 1920s, the world was shifting. Empires had fallen, revolutions had burned through capitals, and the Soviet Union had risen from the ashes of czars. And in Moscow, whispers of Shambhala began to appear in the most unlikely places. At first, it was scholars and Orientalists who spoke of it, filing reports about Tibetan prophecies and Mongolian legends. But soon men in the new Soviet government began to take notice. If there truly was a hidden kingdom with ancient wisdom, could it be harnessed? Could it serve the revolution? Could the Soviet sworn enemies of religion justify sending expeditions in search of what seemed to be a myth? And yet they did. One of the most fascinating figures to emerge in this time was Nicholas Roerich, a Russian painter, philosopher, and mystic. Between 1924 and 1928, Roerich led a great expedition across Central Asia, through India, Tibet, Mongolia, and the Altai Mountains. Officially, his journeys were about culture, archaeology, and art. Unofficially, they carried the weight of something more. Roerich believed he was searching for signs of Shambhala. His journals described strange lights in the sky, radiant visions of hidden cities, and encounters with villagers who spoke of valleys that opened and closed like living things. One account even describes a glowing disk that hovered silently above his caravan before vanishing into the clouds, an object that today we would call a UFO, but which Roerich himself linked to Shambhala. The Soviets watched him closely. Was he a mystic, a spy, or something in between? Washington later intercepted his communications, uncertain whether Roerich was serving Moscow, searching for his own visions, or quietly working for both. But what matters is this: Shambhala had entered the realm of geopolitics. It was no longer a myth confined to scripture. It was now a target for governments who believed knowledge was power and myths were weapons. And then came the Nazis. No regime in modern history was as obsessed with occult knowledge as Hitler's Third Reich. Himmler, head of the SS, devoured every scrap of legend that could be bent into ideology. He believed in a primordial race, an ancient bloodline that linked the Aryan myth to lost civilizations. And in his archives, the name Shambhala appeared again and again. Himmler was convinced that Tibet might hold the key to this ancient lineage, that perhaps the Himalayas hid not only monks and monasteries, but survivors of a forgotten age. In 1938, he sent an SS expedition into Tibet. On the surface, it was a scientific mission: zoology, anthropology, geography. Beneath the surface, it was something else entirely. The unit carried measuring devices, notebooks, and maps, but also a mandate that was far stranger: to search for evidence of the primordial homeland of the Aryan race. They interviewed monks, measured skulls, collected artifacts. And always beneath their questions was the obsession with Shambhala. What they truly found is still debated. Some documents were destroyed in the war, others remain buried in archives. But the fact remains: Himmler believed. He believed Shambhala was real, and that it held something worth seeking, something worth sending soldiers into the roof of the world to find. Can you imagine the stakes? A world on the brink of global war, and deep within the Himalayas, an SS expedition trudging through the snow, convinced that somewhere beyond the next ridge lay a kingdom armed with secrets older than Rome. They sought Shambhala not as a spiritual refuge but as a weapon. And if the prophecy spoke of a final war, perhaps they imagined themselves as the chosen army destined to rise, to claim, to rule. The arrogance of it is staggering, and yet the archives prove they tried. The monks, of course, gave nothing. They smiled, they spoke in riddles, they offered tea, but the gates of Shambhala do not open to those who seek with greed. The expedition returned to Germany with artifacts, notes, and measurements, but without the kingdom they craved. Shambhala had slipped from their grasp as easily as snow through fingers. And yet the obsession did not die with the fall of the Reich. It simply changed hands again. As the world divided into East and West, the Cold War drew its iron curtain across continents. In Washington, in Langley, in the quiet corridors of the CIA, Tibet became a point of interest. Officially, it was about geopolitics, the struggle against China, the use of Tibet as a buffer zone in the great game of the 20th century. But unofficially, another kind of curiosity took root. Files began to circulate about psychic phenomena, altered states of consciousness, and the possibility of remote viewing. Could human perception itself be weaponized? Could the mind travel where the body could not? And in these discussions, the whispers of Shambhala reappeared. If Shambhala was not a place to be invaded, perhaps it was a state to be imitated. If monks could reach visions of hidden kingdoms, perhaps their techniques could be studied, copied, and turned into intelligence operations. Declassified documents now show the CIA's fascination with Tibetan practices during the 1950s and 60s. They studied mantras, breathing techniques, and meditative states. They asked refugees about visions, about prophecies, about hidden valleys. Always beneath the language of national security lay the same question: what if Shambhala was real? And if it was real, what if someone else found it first? The irony is almost painful. Shambhala, described for centuries as a realm that opens only to those of pure intent, became the object of desire for regimes that wanted only power. The Soviets sought it as a weapon of revolution. The Nazis hunted it as proof of racial destiny. The CIA studied it as a tool for psychic espionage. And yet, for all their maps, their spies, their expeditions, not one of them ever truly found it. Because Shambhala is not a place you take by force. It is not a valley you stumble into with rifles and notebooks. It is a gate that opens only to those the prophecy calls worthy. And still the legend persists. In villages across Tibet and Mongolia, people still whisper of valleys that shine with impossible light, of bells that ring from nowhere, of travelers who vanish for days and return, fill their eyes with something they cannot describe. In monasteries, monks still turn prayer wheels and speak softly of the time when Rudra Chakrin will ride. And in archives across Moscow, Berlin, and Washington, the word Shambhala still sits underlined, coded, half erased but never forgotten. So ask yourself, why did three of the most powerful forces of the 20th century, the Soviets, the Nazis, and the CIA, become obsessed with a myth? Why did they spend money, lives, and years chasing something monks say you cannot find unless it chooses you? Did they know something we do not? Did they glimpse evidence, just enough to keep them searching, that Shambhala is not a parable but a hidden truth? Perhaps the better question is this: what if they succeeded? What if in some hidden archive behind black ink and stamped seals lies the record of a door that did open, of a valley that did reveal itself, of knowledge taken from Shambhala and kept in silence? We may never know, but the mountains remember, and the prophecy waits. The prophecy of Shambhala is not a gentle parable whispered for comfort at night. It is a storm dressed in scripture, of fire hidden beneath the calm of chanting monks. The Kalachakra speaks with a voice that trembles between promise and warning. When the world drowns in corruption, when leaders crown themselves with cruelty, when machines of destruction blot out the horizon, then the armies of Shambhala will rise. Not armies of conquest, not armies of empire, but something else. Forces that burn away the illusion of permanence, that restore the balance by cutting through the rot. And at their head, Rudra Chakrin, the wrathful wheel-turner, who rides not with mercy but with precision, who waits centuries only to move once, and when he moves, the earth itself must listen. Imagine a world that has reached such a point. Roads choked with weapons, skies humming with iron birds, leaders who mistake their appetites for destiny. Now imagine monks hidden in high monasteries repeating this prophecy, not as metaphor but as inevitability. To them, the war of Shambhala is not myth, it is a timetable. And if you listen carefully, you realize the timetable may no longer belong to the future. It may belong to us. Westerners who first encountered the prophecy often misunderstood it. They thought it meant that somewhere in the snow there was an army sharpening its blades, a secret kingdom stockpiling weapons. But Tibetans spoke differently. They said the army of Shambhala is not seen until the world has earned its vision. That the soldiers are not men of flesh but forces of destiny. And yet for those who came from empires, this subtlety was unbearable. They heard hidden kingdom and thought fortress. They heard weapons of light and thought machines. They heard prophecy and thought strategy. And so began the long, strange pursuit of Shambhala by governments, generals, and spies. But before the world's armies trampled after the myth, there were visionaries. And among them one stands like a figure painted against the horizon, Nicholas Roerich. A Russian painter and mystic, Roerich was no ordinary traveler. His canvases glowed with impossible landscapes, mountains dripping with color like molten glass, skies pulsing with the weight of something unseen. Between 1924 and 1928, he led a vast expedition through Central Asia, India, Tibet, Mongolia, the Altai. His caravan carried not only supplies but manuscripts, instruments, and a hunger that could not be explained by science alone. Rorich was searching for Shambhala. His journals are haunting. He wrote of valleys that seemed to rearrange themselves overnight, of mountain passes, where the air vibrated with a sound no one could place. In one entry, he described a glowing disk that hovered above his caravan, silent, radiant, and then gone in a blink. His companions, hardened travelers, admitted they saw it too. To them it was a UFO. To Rorich it was a sign, Shambhala, watching, reminding, guiding. He painted visions of radiant cities of kings crowned not with jewels, but with light, of thresholds between the visible and the unseen. He claimed that villagers spoke to him of valleys that opened like doors, where one moment there was only rock and snow, and the next a glow so bright it erased shadow. The Soviets tracked him closely. Officially he was an artist. Unofficially he was too close to something they feared and desired in equal measure. Moscow was an atheist state, its rulers sworn against superstition. And yet in the 1920s and 30s expeditions were funded into Tibet and Mongolia under the guise of ethnography, linguistics, and geology. But beneath the paperwork lay a different hunger. If there truly was a kingdom hidden in the mountains, perhaps it held knowledge. Knowledge that could serve the revolution, or perhaps shield it. Lenin had died, Stalin was rising, and the machinery of power was remaking itself. Somewhere in those halls of marble and fear someone whispered the word Shambhala, and the whisper was not dismissed. Across the continent another set of ears caught the same word, and in those ears it twisted into something far darker. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was a man obsessed with the occult. He filled his libraries with runes, relics, and manuscripts that most scholars would have dismissed as fantasy. But Himmler did not dismiss, he devoured. And among his obsessions was the idea of a primordial race, an ancient bloodline, whose descendants he believed were destined to rule. Tibet, with its height, its mystery, and its whispers of hidden kingdoms, became an irresistible target, and Shambhala, half legend, half prophecy, was treated not as myth, but as evidence waiting to be collected. In 1938, Himmler authorized the German Tibet expedition. On the surface, it was a scientific mission. The team carried zoological instruments, anthropological notebooks, measuring devices. They claimed they were studying high-altitude biology, local customs, and climate. But the shadows around them told a different story. These men were also SS officers loyal to Himmler's vision. They interviewed monks searching for mentions of hidden cities. They measured skulls, convinced that Tibet might be the cradle of an ancient Aryan race. And they carried maps that marked not only rivers and valleys, but whispers. Places villagers said were forbidden, caves, where the air hummed, ridges where lights were seen. The expedition has been dissected for decades, but its truth remains slippery. Some documents survived, describing detailed measurements and collections. Others were destroyed in the war. Some perhaps remain sealed in archives still classified. But what is clear is this: the Nazis believed. They believed enough to send men into the roof of the world, believing that somewhere in those mountains was a door. If they could force it open, they might seize knowledge, relics, even weapons that could change the fate of the Reich. Can you imagine it? In the same years when the world was preparing for a war of tanks and planes, Himmler dreamed of monks with ancient scrolls of cities that shone with unearthly light of Shambhala, not as prophecy, but as arsenal. But the monks were not fools. They smiled, politely offered tea, spoke in riddles. To questions of Shambhala, they answered only with silence or with words too elusive to grasp. The Nazis left with artifacts, measurements, and stories. But Shambhala itself remained untouched, unbent, unseen. And when the Reich fell in fire, the obsession did not vanish. It drifted like a rumor carried by wind into new hands. As the Cold War froze the world into East and West, Tibet became more than a high plateau. It became a pawn in the great game of ideology. China occupied it. India eyed it. The Soviets still dreamed of influence. And across the ocean in Langley, Virginia, a new kind of obsession was taking shape. The CIA had been born into paranoia, and paranoia breeds curiosity. In their files you find words that seem strange for an intelligence agency: psychic phenomena, remote viewing, altered states of consciousness. They studied monks not only for political leverage, but for what their minds could do. Could a man trained in meditation see beyond walls? Could he perceive what satellites could not? Could he find Shambhala not with boots but with thought? Declassified documents show that in the 1950s and 60s American intelligence studied Tibetan practices. They brought refugees into labs, asked them to meditate, to describe visions, to focus on distant places. They wanted to weaponize the mind itself. And in those quiet clinical rooms, the word Shambhala surfaced again. If it was not a place, perhaps it was a state of perception. If it was not a valley, perhaps it was a frequency. If it could not be conquered, perhaps it could be replicated in the mind of a spy. And yet, as always, the monks gave nothing. They smiled, they offered mantras, but the gates did not open, because Shambhala cannot be forced. It does not answer to greed, to ambition, or to fear. It opens only to those who have become what it requires. Still, the fact remains, the Soviets sought it. The Nazis hunted it. The CIA studied it. All of them in their own way chased a kingdom that monks say is hidden not because of geography, but because of worthiness. And yet they spent money, lives, and years convinced that somewhere in the snow lay a truth too dangerous to ignore. Ask yourself this: why would three of the most powerful regimes of the 20th century, all ruthless, all pragmatic, chase a myth? Why would they send expeditions, fund research, and file reports about a kingdom that supposedly does not exist? Did they know something we do not? Did they glimpse enough to keep the fire alive? Perhaps in some sealed archive in Moscow, Berlin, or Washington, there is a file that describes a valley that opened once briefly before closing forever. And if that file exists, what did they find? Was it scripture? Was it relic? Or was it something far more terrifying? Proof that the prophecy of Shambhala is not waiting for the future, but already moving in the present? Because sometimes in villages scattered across the Himalayas, people still whisper. They whisper of bells that ring in the air where no bells exist. They whisper of travelers who vanish into valleys that glow like dawn and return days later, their faces pale with awe. They whisper of armies that will rise not from capitals but from mountains. And they whisper of a king wrathful and radiant who waits patient in a city that the unworthy will never see. The Soviets could not force the door. The Nazis could not bend it. The CIA could not bribe it. And yet the prophecy endures. Rudra Chakrin waits. The gates remain. And somewhere in the folds of the Himalayas, Shambhala listens. When Western explorers first stumbled upon the whispers of Shambhala, they did not hear them as prophecy. They heard them as confirmation. Confirmation of something they already believed in secret. That the world was full of hidden masters, ancient cities, and truths deliberately kept from common men. For centuries, Europe had chased the dream of a lost golden age, from Plato's Atlantis to medieval tales of Prester John. So when rumors of a radiant kingdom hidden in the Himalayas reached their ears, they did not think myth, they thought proof. By the late 19th century, the word Shambhala had already crossed oceans. It appeared in salons lit by gas lamps, where mystics in flowing robes spoke of hidden brotherhoods and ancient wisdom. At the center of this strange new obsession was the Theosophical Society founded by the enigmatic Helena Blavatsky. Blavatsky claimed she had been in contact with secret masters, beings who guided the evolution of humanity from hidden sanctuaries deep within Asia. Some, she said, lived in Shambhala. To her, Shambhala was not merely a Buddhist kingdom. It was the spiritual headquarters of the world. Her followers devoured her books. They believed Shambhala was the dwelling place of the Great White Brotherhood, a fraternity of enlightened beings who had existed for millennia, watching humanity stumble, guiding it gently from behind the curtain of history. They were not gods, not angels, but something else. Immortals, adepts, perhaps even survivors of civilizations long destroyed. Blavatsky described them as men of immense knowledge who could move across the world unseen, who could send messages by thought alone, who could steer the tides of civilization without ever appearing on a throne. And in her vision, Shambhala was their capital. It was a powerful idea, and it sank deep into the veins of the West, because it offered both reassurance and temptation. Reassurance that there were guardians watching over humanity, preventing us from destroying ourselves, and temptation that if one could reach them, one might seize wisdom denied to the masses. For some, Shambhala was paradise. For others, it was a fortress of secrets to be breached. But Theosophy was only the beginning. By the early 20th century, Shambhala had become entangled with another strange theory, hollow earth. Popularized by writers like Jules Verne in fiction and later taken seriously by occultists, the hollow earth theory suggested that our planet was not solid but honeycombed with vast inner realms. According to some believers, Shambhala was not in the mountains at all. It was inside the earth, connected by hidden tunnels, stretching from Tibet to Antarctica, from the Gobi Desert to the poles. These tunnels, they said, were the veins of a world beneath our world, a labyrinth of cities and civilizations hidden since the dawn of time. The hollow earth enthusiasts claimed that entrances to Shambhala existed in caves in polar openings in the craters of extinct volcanoes. Some even whispered that Shambhala might be the same as Agartha, another mythical subterranean kingdom said to lie beneath the Himalayas. Agartha was described as a vast network of halls, illuminated not by the sun, but by a radiant inner light, where an advanced civilization thrived unseen. And if Shambhala and Agartha were one, then the hidden kings of prophecy were not only lords of a mountain city, but masters of the inner earth itself. It was a seductive image, and it caught the imagination of not only mystics but militaries. After all, if Shambhala was underground, perhaps its tunnels could be found, mapped, and exploited. Expeditions in the early 20th century scoured the Gobi Desert, probing caves and fissures, convinced that somewhere a passage led down into the hidden kingdom. But the entrances, if they existed, refused to reveal themselves. As these legends multiplied, another thread wound itself around the name of Shambhala, Hyperborea. To the ancient Greeks, Hyperborea was a paradise in the far north, a land of eternal spring where the sun never set and men lived in peace for centuries. In the 19th and 20th centuries, occultists began to link Hyperborea with Shambhala, claiming that the hidden kingdom in the Himalayas was in fact a surviving fragment of this primordial paradise. Perhaps they suggested Shambhala was a colony of Hyperboreans who had retreated underground or into the mountains when the climate of the north changed. To the Nazis obsessed with racial mythology, this was irresistible. They came to believe that Shambhala might hold evidence of the ancient Aryan homeland. They sought a key to their twisted ideology. But the legend did not stop there. By the mid-20th century, whispers of Shambhala began to seep into another realm, conspiracy theories about extraterrestrials. Some writers suggested that the radiant city described in Tibetan texts was not of this earth at all, but a base of otherworldly visitors hidden away to observe humanity. The glowing lights described by Roerich in the 1920s, the discs that hovered over his caravan, were seized upon by UFO enthusiasts as proof. To them, Shambhala was not only a hidden city, but a stargate, a portal linking our world with others. And suddenly the Buddhist prophecy of armies wielding weapons of fire and light seemed less like metaphor and more like the memory of technologies too advanced for our ancestors to describe. Even in the Cold War, the myth refused to die. In fact, it grew. The Soviets, the Nazis, the CIA, each had chased Shambhala in their own way. But in the 1970s and 80s, whispers began to circulate that governments had found more than they admitted. That perhaps deep in the Himalayas there were regions where compasses spun, where aircraft vanished, where satellites returned only static. Some claimed that entire valleys were blurred out on maps. Others swore that photographs of certain mountain ranges were classified, filed away under reasons that had nothing to do with defense. And then there were the whistleblowers. Men and women who emerged from the shadows of intelligence, claiming that Shambhala was real and that governments knew it. Some described underground facilities in Tibet guarded and sealed. Others spoke of contact with beings who were not quite human, not quite divine, but something in between. They claimed that Shambhala's kings were not only watching, but intervening, that the final war had already begun, not with armies, but with ideas, with shifts in consciousness that were spreading quietly across the world. Could it be true? Could Shambhala exist not as a myth, not as a metaphor, but as a hidden reality that powerful men have sought and failed to claim? If so, why has it not revealed itself? Perhaps because the prophecy is not about geography but timing. Perhaps Shambhala opens only when the world has reached the brink, when the balance tips too far, when the need is greater than the greed, and perhaps that time is closer than we think. Imagine it a kingdom radiant and untouched, hidden for centuries waiting. A place where wisdom is preserved, where kings hold knowledge that could end our wars, cure our hunger, and unmask our illusions. And yet, if it revealed itself too soon, humanity would tear it apart, turn its treasures into weapons, repeat the same cycle that has broken us before. So it waits, and while it waits, the powerful scramble, the mystics dream, and the mountains guard their silence. But the prophecy does not wait forever. Rudra Chakrin still waits, and when he rides, the illusion of permanence will burn away like morning mist. Whether Shambhala is a city, in the snow a kingdom beneath the earth, or a door into other worlds, its shadow looms larger than myth. Because every time humanity reaches too far, every time we edge too close to destroying ourselves, the name Shambhala rises again, like a warning whispered through stone. Not yet, not yours, not until the world is ready. And if the world is never ready, then perhaps Shambhala will remain forever unseen. Or perhaps in our darkest hour it will rise regardless, whether we deserve it or not. The myth of Shambhala is older than the nations that have tried to claim it, older than the religions that have painted it with new colors. But myths, when they survive this long, do not survive by chance. They survive because they carry something humanity is not allowed to forget. And as the 20th century dissolved into the 21st, the whispers did not vanish. They grew louder, stranger, closer. You can hear them in the testimonies of mountaineers who swear they saw valleys shift before their eyes. A German climber in the 1980s wrote of walking through a snow pass in Nepal, only to find himself staring into a meadow filled with wildflowers blooming impossibly in the dead of winter. He swore the air was warmer, the birdsong unfamiliar, the light golden in a way he had never seen. His companions laughed at him later, called it altitude sickness. But he insisted for 1 hour he was not in the world he knew. He believed he had brushed against the threshold of Shambhala, and then as suddenly as it appeared it was gone. The snow returned, the wind howled, and the valley closed like a fist. You can see it in the maps. Cartographers have complained for decades of mountain regions in the Himalayas where data refuses to settle. Satellite images come back blurred, corrupted, or mysteriously blacked out. Officially, the explanations are simple: weather interference, technical errors, government censorship. But if you look closely, you notice something uncanny. The same valleys are blurred again and again, year after year, even with new satellites, even with new technology. Always the same places, as if the land itself refuses to be photographed. When asked, agencies deny it, yet the blanks remain, and in those blanks the legend breathes. There are stories of soldiers too. During the 1962 Sino-Indian War, troops reported strange lights moving across the mountains, not like aircraft, not like artillery, but like silent orbs of fire that drifted and then vanished. The official reports filed them away as atmospheric anomalies, but among the men who saw them a rumor spread. The lights were watchers, guardians of a hidden city that did not want to be seen. Decades later, similar lights were reported by Indian border patrols. Again, the files were stamped, explained, forgotten. But the pattern was clear: the same valleys, the same silence, the same lights. And then there are the whispers of whistleblowers. In the 1990s, a retired intelligence officer in Russia claimed on record that the Soviets had discovered something extraordinary in Tibet in the 1960s. He spoke of a valley that did not match physics, where compasses spun and radios died. He claimed a detachment had entered and not returned. The survivors, he said, were incoherent, their eyes wide, with something between awe and terror. He would not say more. The interview ended, and the man died 2 years later. His words were dismissed by most as the ramblings of a bitter old man. But for those who listened closely, his warning was unmistakably: Shambhala had been touched, and it had not welcomed the intrusion. Western whistleblowers tell similar tales. A declassified CIA report mentions Tibetan lamas demonstrating control over their body temperatures in freezing cold, drying wet sheets on their backs in the snow. Buried in the same file is a fragment, barely a sentence. Certain practitioners claim access to a hidden valley source of knowledge, uncorroborated. Why include such a note in an intelligence document, unless someone somewhere thought it worth recording? Unless even the most pragmatic of agencies could not entirely ignore the myth? The question grows darker when you consider the timing. The Kalachakra prophecy speaks of an age when machines of fire will darken the skies, when rulers will worship greed as destiny, when compassion will be cast aside as weakness. Look around you now. Do we not live in that time? The sky is grown with aircraft, drones, and missiles. Leaders boast of wealth as though it were a virtue. Wars are waged not for survival but for profit. If the prophecy was ever to unfold, why not now? And if Rudra Chakrin waits, is his hand already on the reins of his white steed? Some say yes. Some say the final war has already begun, not with tanks or armies, but with shifts in consciousness. They speak of movements rising across the world, sudden awakenings, sudden revolts against cruelty. They claim these are not coincidences, but ripples, waves sent from Shambhala itself, softening the world before the storm. And yet there are others who whisper that Shambhala is no longer content with whispers, that sightings of strange lights, blurred maps, lost expeditions are the first cracks in the wall, that soon the gates will open fully, not just for monks or visionaries, but for all to see. But here lies the danger. What happens if Shambhala reveals itself in our age? Would we treat it as sanctuary? Or would governments rush to claim it, weaponize it, twist its wisdom into technology for destruction? History suggests the latter. The Soviets, the Nazis, the CIA all saw Shambhala not as a teacher but as a prize. Why should we believe our world leaders today would be different? If Shambhala appeared, it would not take long before drones circled above it, before scientists demanded samples, before generals drew up plans for control. And perhaps this is why Shambhala remains hidden, not because it cannot be found, but because it refuses to be desecrated. Yet there are hints that its kings are watching still. In Tibetan monasteries, initiates are told that the war of Shambhala will not be fought only with weapons but with minds, that the true battlefield is perception, that ignorance and cruelty will collapse not when they are bombed, but when humanity collectively sees through them. And perhaps that is the real power of Shambhala, not an army in the snow, but an awakening that spreads silently, invisibly, until one day the illusions of our age shatter like glass. Still the prophecy promises more. Rudra Chakrin will ride, the armies will rise, the forces of darkness will fall. Whether we imagine this as tanks meeting visions, or as consciousness overturning tyranny, the outcome is the same, a reckoning. The last king of Shambhala is not gentle, he is not patient. He comes only when all else has failed. And if the state of our world is any measure, that hour may not be far. Imagine for a moment what it would mean if tomorrow a valley opened and the city of light revealed itself. Imagine the first satellite images leaking online, golden domes, radiant streets, a civilization untouched. Imagine the panic in capitals, across the world, the rush of governments to explain, to contain, to control. Imagine the disbelief, the denial, the cover-up. And then imagine the prophecy unfolding not as myth, but as fact, with the armies of Shambhala not merely symbolic, but real, marching, radiant, unstoppable. Would humanity bow in awe? Or would we, true to form, raise our weapons, determined to conquer the very kingdom sent to save us? That is the final riddle. That is why Shambhala waits. Not because it is not ready, but because we are not. And so the legend endures. In the monasteries of Tibet, monks still turn their wheels, repeating the prophecy. In the villages of the Himalayas, old men still whisper of valleys that glow with dawn even at midnight. In the archives of government, sealed files still carry the word Shambhala, underlined, redacted, never dismissed. And in the dreams of seekers, in the visions of mystics, in the silence of mountains, the city still shines, waiting. Perhaps the prophecy will never unfold. Perhaps Shambhala will remain forever a mirror we chase but never grasp. Or perhaps one day, when the world burns too brightly with its own cruelty, a door will open and the armies will rise and Rudra Chakrin will ride. And on that day the myth will end and history will begin again. Until then the question remains, is Shambhala a legend, a memory, or a reality hidden just beyond the next ridge? You will have to decide for yourself. But remember this, every myth that survives carries a truth, and Shambhala has survived longer than most. Ask yourself why, ask yourself what waits behind the door, and ask yourself, when the gates finally open, whether we will be ready to enter, or whether we will be the reason the city closes forever. Legends do not survive by accident. They migrate. They change their clothes, speak in new tongues, but at their heart they remain the same. Shambhala may be born in the chants of Tibetan monks, but its shadow can be found far beyond those mountains, woven into the myths of continents that never touched. What does it mean when the same story appears again and again in places separated by oceans and centuries? Does it mean humanity dreams the same dream everywhere? Or does it mean we are remembering the same truth scattered like shards of a broken mirror? Think of the Inca priests in South America. They spoke of a golden city hidden in the jungle, untouched by conquerors, radiant with wealth beyond imagination. The Spanish called it El Dorado, and they burned whole forests searching for it. But the Incas never described it as just a vault of gold. They spoke of a city of wisdom, a sanctuary preserved for the end of days, when balance would be restored. Does that not sound like Shambhala clothed in different symbols? A hidden city radiant, sealed away, waiting for an appointed hour. Or look to the Greeks. Atlantis, a civilization advanced beyond its time, destroyed in a single night because of its arrogance, its hunger for power. Plato spoke of it as memory, not myth. He claimed it lay beyond the pillars of Hercules, swallowed by the sea. But the echoes are unmistakable. An advanced society, a golden age, lost its survivors, perhaps retreating into secrecy. Theosophists later wove Atlantis directly into Shambhala, claiming the hidden kings were its inheritors, preserving wisdom against the folly of men. If Atlantis fell, did its remnants become Shambhala? A kingdom hidden not beneath waves, but behind mountains, waiting for the next cycle to begin? The Mayans too whispered of a place. They spoke of Aslan, the place of origin, the hidden homeland of their ancestors, lost but not destroyed. The Aztecs carried the same memory, a radiant city sealed away, promising return. Each culture framed it differently, but the melody is the same. Somewhere beyond reach lies a sanctuary of knowledge, and when the world collapses, it will return. How many times must the same song be sung before we stop calling it coincidence? Even in the north, the Norse sagas carry a shadow of the same theme. They spoke of a final battle, Ragnarok, when the forces of chaos would rise, when fire and frost would devour the world. But they also spoke of survivors of a hidden hall where men of wisdom would endure, emerging after the flames to begin again. Shambhala by another name. A kingdom not destroyed, only hidden, its timing set by the wheel of destiny. And in the deserts of Arabia, in the Quran and Hadith, whispers of a final army rise as well. The figure of the Mahdi, the guided one, who will appear at the end of time with forces of justice sweeping away tyranny, confronting the armies of oppression. A final war, a final reckoning. Buddhist prophecy, Norse saga, Islamic eschatology, they all lean toward the same horizon. Different names, same shape. Shambhala is not alone. It is part of a pattern, a memory humanity cannot erase. But here is the darker question: what if governments already know this? What if they see the same pattern we do, but in archives, in documents, in classified reports? What if they have evidence that Shambhala is not metaphor, but fact, and they hide it because the truth would unmake the order of the world? Consider the case of Tibet itself. In 1950, China invaded, absorbing the plateau into its empire. Since then, Tibet has been one of the most restricted regions on earth. Foreign journalists are barred. Monks are silenced. Entire valleys are declared off limits. Roads appear on maps that no one is allowed to walk. Officially, it is about politics, control, borders. But why such intensity? Why such secrecy? Could it be that in those mountains, in those valleys, something more than politics is at stake? Could it be that beneath the rhetoric, they are guarding something older, something they do not want the world to see? Whispers claim that in the early years of the occupation, Chinese soldiers stumbled upon a valley unlike any other. They reported lush meadows in impossible altitudes, ancient ruins that did not match Tibetan architecture, strange lights that hummed in the sky. The files were buried, the soldiers silenced, the valley sealed. No proof survives, only rumor. But in rumor, sometimes truth hides more securely than in fact. Antarctica offers another riddle. Why in recent decades has that frozen continent become the focus of sudden intense restriction? Whole regions are declared off limits to civilians. Satellites show strange anomalies beneath the ice, structures that seem geometric tunnels that stretch for miles. Officially, it is geology, climate, ice. Unofficially, some whisper it is Shambhala's twin, a southern gate, a mirror kingdom beneath the ice. And if you believe the hollow earth theories, then Shambhala is not singular, but part of a network, a web of hidden sanctuaries stretching from Tibet to Antarctica, from the Himalayas to the poles. Perhaps the kings of Shambhala are not kings of a single valley, but guardians of a system that spans the globe, unseen, untouchable. Now imagine for a moment what it would mean if this were true. If governments already knew if files in Beijing, Moscow, Washington all contained the same fragments, testimonies of valleys that glow with light, photographs of blurred landscapes, instruments that fail without reason. If generals and ministers already whisper the name Shambhala behind closed doors, not as legend but as problem. Because for them Shambhala is not hope, it is threat. A kingdom beyond control, immune to weapons, immune to politics. A power that answers to no nation. What government could tolerate such a thing? The instinct is always the same: suppress, deny, contain. And yet sometimes the suppression slips. A declassified Soviet file mentions anomalous geographic region coordinates redacted. A CIA memo notes claims of Tibetan adepts accessing hidden knowledge, uncorroborated. A Chinese defector whispers of forbidden valleys where soldiers are forbidden to march. Always half erased, always incomplete, but the fragments form a mosaic. The picture is faint but undeniable. The myth has left fingerprints in the archives of power. So what does it mean? If Shambhala is real, if it waits, then the prophecy of Rudra Chakrin is not merely metaphor. It is content. Perhaps the kings of Shambhala do not wait passively. Perhaps they already intervene subtly, invisibly. Perhaps the sudden collapses of empires, the sudden awakenings of movements, the sudden crumbling of lies are not accidents, but whispers of Shambhala's hand. If the final war is fought not only with weapons but with minds, perhaps we are already in it and do not know it. Think of the last century. How many regimes rose and fell in fire, undone not by armies, but by truth, by the sudden refusal of people to believe the lies they had obeyed for decades. How many tyrants fled not from bullets but from voices. Could these waves be the ripples of Shambhala, testing the world, nudging the balance, preparing for the hour when the gates must open fully? And if so, what comes next? The monks say Shambhala cannot be seen until you are ready. Perhaps humanity as a whole must become ready. Perhaps the wars, the greed, the cruelty are the test. Perhaps the kings watch, waiting to see if we can turn. Before the wheel demands the wrathful turning. And if we cannot, then Rudra Chakrin rides, the armies rise, the war begins. But here lies the twist. What if it has already begun? Not in fire, not in thunder, but in silence. What if the awakening of millions, the global revolts, the sudden cracks in the old systems are not random but coordinated? Not by men, but by a kingdom hidden in the snow? What if Shambhala is already moving, already influencing, already shaping the future without ever revealing its gates? If that is true, then the world is not waiting for Shambhala. The world is already inside its prophecy. And the question is no longer whether the gates will open, but whether we will survive when they do. Legends, if they endure long enough, begin to bend toward the present. They start as echoes of the past, then shift into prophecies of the future, and finally, if we are not careful, they arrive at our doorstep, disguised as coincidence. Shambhala is no different. For centuries it was a whisper among monks, then a rumor among mystics, then an obsession among generals. But in our age it has begun to feel less like myth and more like mirror. When we peer into the story of Shambhala, now we no longer see only a hidden city in the Himalayas. We see ourselves, our technologies, our ambitions, our catastrophes, our hope. The Kalachakra speaks of a time when machines of fire would darken the skies. Once this sounded like poetry. Now it sounds like drones, missiles, satellites. It speaks of a war not of swords, but of devices that can annihilate cities in moments. Once this was metaphor. Now it is daily news. It speaks of rulers who mistake greed for destiny, who wear cruelty as crown. Once this was warning. Now it feels like prophecy unfolding on our screens every morning. Shambhala was always described as hidden until the world was ready. But what if ready means something darker? That the gates open not when we are virtuous, but when we are desperate. Look at what we are building. Artificial intelligence that learns faster than we can explain. Machines that calculate, predict, decide. systems that store all our history, all our knowledge in glowing vaults of silicon. Are we not in our own way reconstructing Shambhala, a repository of wisdom radiant with light hidden in machines instead of mountains? Some have even called the internet a nervous system, for the planet a kind of collective mind. Does that not echo the Tibetan vision of a city, where knowledge is alive, where wisdom breathes in the very stones? What if Shambhala is not only hidden in the Himalayas, but waiting to be rebuilt by us? And what if our digital vaults are a pale, dangerous imitation of the real one? Consider this. Monks say Shambhala is hidden until humanity has reached its breaking point. In our age, we build artificial paradises, virtual world simulations, metaverses, dreaming of escape. But what if Shambhala is the original? A city that is both real and not real, both physical and transcendent, a blueprint of how to preserve wisdom against collapse? And what if our AIR simulations are us groping toward the same goal without admitting we are following an older script? Theosophists said Shambhala was the headquarters of Earth's hidden masters. Today, our corporations and governments dream of data centers that govern the planet, called halls of humming machines where invisible forces shape lives. Is it coincidence? Or is it repetition, a cycle we are doomed to replay until we learn the difference between wisdom and control? The prophecy of Rudra Chakrin also speaks of a final war that is not merely external, it is internal, a war of perception. In Tibetan teachings, the enemy of Shambhala is not just armies of cruelty, it is ignorance itself. And what is our greatest struggle today, if not ignorance wrapped in information? Billions of voices, endless data, but truth drowned in noise. We are in a sense already in the war of Shambhala, but the battlefield is digital. Our minds are the terrain. Our illusions are the weapons. And perhaps the kings of Shambhala do not ride against tanks and planes, but against lies, against the poison of falsehood that seeps into our very thoughts. If that is so, then we are already enlisted, whether we admit it or not. But there is another possibility. Some whisper that Shambhala is not only earthly but cosmic, that it is not merely a hidden kingdom in the Himalayas, but a node in a vast network of civilizations scattered across the stars. The UFOs described by Nicholas Roerich in the 1920s, the glowing discs over his caravan, are seen differently in our time. Today we call them unidentified aerial phenomena. Governments release blurry footage, admit they cannot explain. Could it be that Shambhala is not a solitary sanctuary, but one branch of a greater tree whose roots and branches stretch beyond Earth itself? That its kings are not only guardians of humanity, but envoys in a cosmic alliance, a hidden federation that appears only when balance must be restored? This theory is not as far-fetched as it sounds. In Hindu cosmology, Shambhala is linked with cycles of yugas, cosmic ages, that extend beyond human memory. Each cycle ends in destruction and begins anew. And in each cycle, certain sanctuaries survive, preserving wisdom until the new age dawns. If this is true, then Shambhala is not just Tibetan, not just earthly. It is universal. Perhaps every world that reaches a certain threshold, every civilization that teeters on the edge of self-destruction has its Shambhala. Perhaps it is less a place and more a pattern, a principle of survival woven into the cosmos. Now look at our own trajectory. We send probes to Mars, rovers across dusty plains, telescopes into the dark. We dream of colonies on the moon, on other planets. We speak of building sanctuaries beyond Earth, vaults of DNA and data hidden in orbit or on alien soil to preserve life against catastrophe. Is this not the same impulse? The desire to hide a seed of civilization against fire, to protect a fragment of wisdom against collapse. In our own way, we are becoming the kings of Shambhala, or at least imitating them. Guardians of vaults, curators of memory. But the danger is clear. Without the discipline of compassion, without the clarity of wisdom, our Shambhala becomes nothing more than cold machines, a fortress of arrogance, rather than a sanctuary of light. And so the legend turns its gaze back to us. Perhaps Shambhala is not only hidden in the Himalayas. Perhaps it is hidden in our choices. If we build machines without wisdom, we create a false Shambhala, a counterfeit kingdom that promises salvation but delivers chains. If we open ourselves to compassion, to truth, to balance, perhaps the real gates will open and we will see the radiant city, not as prize but as teacher. The prophecy was never about kings riding out to conquer. It was about humanity deciding whether it will listen, whether it will see, whether it will finally remember. And yet the riddle remains, what if the gates have already opened quietly unseen? What if Shambhala is already here, influencing, guiding, shaping events in ways we cannot perceive? What if the collapses of empires, the sudden awakenings, the inexplicable shifts in history are not random but ripples of its presence? Some monks say the gates open not all at once, but in waves, glimpses, thresholds. Perhaps the final war is not in the future. Perhaps it has already begun. And perhaps we are fighting it every time we choose truth over lies, compassion over cruelty, wisdom over arrogance. So where does that leave us? Standing as always at the edge of a door we cannot force. The armies of Shambhala are not visible on the horizon. Rudra Chakrin has not yet mounted his white steed. And yet, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the hoofbeats. Distant, patient waiting. Perhaps the real question is not whether Shambhala exists, but whether we deserve it. Because when the gates open, it will not be for curiosity or for conquest or for greed. It will be for survival. And in that moment, we will know whether we are ready to walk through or whether the city will close again, leaving us alone with our ruins. Until then, the legend endures. A city of light hidden in the snow. A prophecy that bends into our age. A final war not of nations but of truths. Shambhala waits, patient, unyielding, beyond reach, and yet closer than breath. And one day, when the world has burned enough illusions away, when the wheel has turned to its appointed place, the wrathful king will ride, and the gates will open, and history will be remade. And when that day comes, the only question will be, which side of the prophecy were we truly on? If you're still here with me listening in the dark, you're part of a small circle that refuses to look away from the truths others bury. These are the mysteries they don't want you to know, and we uncover them together every night. Make sure you subscribe now, because if this is what Shambhala hides, imagine what else is waiting. Don't be the one who misses the next revelation. Shambhala may be hidden, but the prophecy is not asleep. The question is not whether it exists, but whether we will be ready when it reveals itself. If this journey pulled you deeper into the shadows of history, subscribe to Mystery Vault now, because tomorrow we uncover a secret even more unsettling, the pyramids. Why did so many civilizations separated by oceans build the same impossible shape? And what if they were all following the same hidden blueprint? That mystery is next.